Hi everyone. I've covered this I've covered this issue in two other videos, and I use the term mob mentality. I stand by that. I think that's absolutely the sort of mindset that we've seen in some of these so-called peaceful protests. Um, this is going to be one of those videos I know will be polarizing and provocative, but so be it. These are things I think have to be said, and if this video could provide a tiny little balance, a tiny little rebuttal to a lot of the propaganda that is out there, then so be it. I'm willing to take insults and trolls if it means giving another point of view. I want to talk about right-wing dishonesty regarding violence and rioting, because I'm seeing a lot of it, quite frankly. Now, before I get into this, by targeting the right in this video, by criticising the right, it doesn't mean that I exclude the left. It doesn't mean that I say the left aren't above embellishment, distortion, and indeed violence as well, because they are. I would say over the past half decade and longer, but particularly over the past half decade, there's been a lot of social disorder in this country. I mean, most prominently last year, but we had unrest during the pandemic as well, and over the whole fallout from the Black Lives Matter thing. I've seen extremism from left and right, so no one can accuse me of being so partisan that I just focus on one side and ignore the other. I've called out both. I mean, during the Just Stop Oil stunts, which were incredibly obnoxious and were in some cases dangerous, I think there were too many people on the left defending them and saying they were just peaceful protesters. Well, now it's the same thing with the right. We're seeing right-wingers come out and flood social media comments with posts about, oh, it's just peaceful protests, it's just families concerned about children's safety. I really think this needs to be broken down a bit and confronted, because a lot of it is based on falsehoods. Firstly, this claim that it's peaceful protest. It's more peaceful than what we saw last year, and it's more peaceful than the thuggery that happened in Ballymena earlier this year in Northern Ireland. But I wouldn't say it's peaceful. I wouldn't say that, gathering outside a hotel and clearly wishing to do harm to those inside is a peaceful thing. This isn't like a situation where people are protesting saying we're concerned about male migrants in a hotel. They're probably all rapists, because we're not going to bother, considering that that's just a generalization that isn't accurate. Because one has been arrested or several have been arrested on serious charges doesn't mean that they're all rapists. You wouldn't see this if it was white Britons. You just wouldn't. You wouldn't see that sort of mentality. So I do question why the double standard. Why is there only this sort of attitude about protecting children when the suspect is a migrant? I suppose you could argue that we had this sort of mentality back in the Solon murders and earlier in the Sarah Payne case in 2000. In that case, the mobs were targeting anyone they suspected of being predators, including white Britons. There were cases of paediatricians targeted because idiots actually thought that actual paedophiles would advertise themselves on a public building. There were women who happened to bear a passing resemblance to Maxine Carr were targeted. Things like that. I've always been deeply uncomfortable with mob mentality. I think it's a very ugly thing. But it's false to claim that these protests are entirely peaceful. They've been squaring up to the police, throwing things at the police. They've been spray painting the hotels. The violence isn't quite as extreme as we've seen previously, but like I say, without the police being there, I do not believe for a second that they would simply hold up placards and make a few speeches and protest that way. I am absolutely sure that if the police were not there and any of those migrants dared to step outside, they would be in real physical danger. And I don't accept that, because one may be guilty of a serious crime for which they should be deported, then it's okay to vilify all of them. I'll cite the case that I interviewed one man, an Afghan, who had fled the Taliban because he was actually trying to promote girls' education. And I don't think that sort of case will be unique. Now, I always say this in these videos, and I know it will fall on hot. I know they won't listen anyway, but I will say it as a matter of putting the record straight for my own stance on this. I'm not naive. I don't think we should let in everyone. I think that people who've committed serious crimes should be deported. The government's just announced that. That's justified. They should be deported. I mean, it's a disgrace that's how they pay the country that's given them refuge. But I do have sympathy for people who genuinely fled war zone or tyranny. And yes, they've technically come here illegally, but they fled that desperate situation of the risk their lives to do this. And then they're in a hotel and they have to put up with a mob outside who want to do them harm. So, imagine being in that situation. It's awful. Now, the protesters keep saying they want to protect children. I think a lot of them, I'll be honest, I think a lot of them do have genuine concerns. If there's, particularly in smaller market towns where there's been an influx of migrants in a hotel, for instance, and there's crime that's going on around that, and some of it may well be carried out by migrants. Okay, that's a problem. It is an issue of integration. It's an issue of social tensions. And I've said before, I think a hotel model is deeply flawed. I think it would be better sending migrants to decommissioned military sites for processing. It should be humane. They should have food. They shouldn't be treated like dangerous criminals, because most of them aren't. But that would be a better model than hotels. The problem with hotels is it just gives us aesthetic that they're living in luxury whilst ordinary people are struggling. But I will say that the right are being very, very dishonest about this. I've literally just seen, there was a Labour councillor who called out what he described as Nazis, and he basically advocated that the throats be cut. That was inciting violence, and he's now facing legal consequences for that. He should. I mean, no matter how angry you are, you just can't advocate violence. You can express anger, you can express disgust, but advocating violence, it just crosses a line. It just can't be normalised. So he should face consequences for that. I'm fine with that. But on that particular story, the comments were full of people saying it's all the left stoking things up. It's all a left-wing fabrication. So according to them, there were no riots last year. There weren't boozed up, in many cases, thugs gathered outside hotels threatening to burn them down. There weren't thugs in Middlesbrough literally stopping cars and trying to pick out different ethnicities inside them. That is literally what happened. There was a street in Middlesbrough which had Asian families that were attacked, in their own homes. I am disgusted, absolutely thoroughly disgusted by anyone who would even try to defend that behaviour. Oh, they're just fed up citizens. No, don't. Don't defend it. Because if you're defending it, if you're excusing them, you're just as bad as they are. Almost. Okay, I'll say almost. I think you're enabling them. I really have a short patience with people who want to defend that sort of behaviour. I think some right-wing publications have been guilty of that. I mean, GB News, when they were talking about the trouble last year, they said, we don't support the violence, but maybe these are just fed-up citizens. It's interesting, a lot of those arrested had lengthy criminal records. We're not talking here about just ordinary people who were fed up. We're talking about opportunistic thugs who used the issue of the migrants, and they used that awful situation with the little girls who were murdered in Southport to excuse what they were doing. It was absolutely opportunistic. In the case of Ballymena, I would say it was a borderline pogrom. You had Filipinos targeted because Romanians were accused of a crime. Now, how anyone could claim that isn't racist is deranged. I've said before that sometimes the left do throw around the term racism, they do throw around the term far right, but I won't apologise for saying that there's clearly far right influence involved in this. There's disinformation being sold online. Do they seriously think, are they seriously going to argue that groups like Homeland, Patriotic Alternative, Britain First, etc., aren't deliberately trying to influence opinion on this? Do they seriously think those groups are just laying back and saying, oh, well, look, we told you so? No, they're actively involved. Tommy Robinson keeps spouting his mouth, fanning the flames. But, you can't criticise St. Tommy. This is just an ordinary bloke standing up against invading masses. I'm sick and tired of the right making excuses for violent riots. As for them being mothers and grandmothers, just because someone's a mother doesn't preclude her from being involved in violence. There was one so-called mother brought her 9-year-old son to a riot while she was throwing stones at the police. What sort of mother does that? So simply because someone may be a mother or a grandmother doesn't mean they're an upstanding citizen. It really doesn't. That is just a status of what they are, but that doesn't automatically preclude them from engaging in criminality. I mean, it's a very manipulative thing. It's people say, one person confronted me when I mentioned the term rampaging mobs, and he says it's a sad day when concerned mothers are described as rampaging mobs. Well, the thugs who were throwing missiles at the police and threatening to set buildings on fire may well have included some mothers. I call them thugs, if that's what they're doing. I mean, I just really feel utter disgust at people who would try to defend this behaviour. And yes, you can argue that the politicians have ignored concerns. You can argue that there's root causes, as Farage did, although I don't think he went far enough in condemning the violence, for all he pretends to be tough on crime. Um, it's quite simple. If you're a decent person, if you're a reasonable person, you will see that as wrong. You will see that setting a stranger's car on fire is wrong. You will see that threatening to burn a building with human beings inside is wrong. If you can't bring yourself to do that, then fuck you. Don't say that you're a decent citizen. Don't say that you're a normal person. And I am troubled by, the abundance of right-wing comments coming out to deny this stuff and defend it. I guarantee you, on the reports about the hotel protests, are full of people saying, "Oh, it's just concerned citizens." The violence hasn't been as explicit and as bad as previously, but it's exactly the same mindset as the rioting thugs last year. And the people on these protests, I have no doubt, will have said, "Oh, those lads were just good citizens." So there's a real denialism at play here, and I'm calling out the right-wing dishonesty. Because the protests are not peaceful. They're not. So stop lying. Stop pretending that you're a good citizen by, throwing stuff at the police or spray painting a building or, in some cases, threatening violence against those inside the building. Where migrants have been arrested, if they're guilty, they should be thrown out. But I don't accept tarring them all with the same brush. That's another thing that hasn't been challenged sufficiently. People say it's all about protecting women and girls. Well, you know something? The mobs that were in the Deep South in the first half of the 20th century, they were acting their extreme violence out of the mindset they were to protecting white women from black men. So you had cases where black teenagers, I'm thinking of the case of Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas, 1916. He was tortured by the mob, hung up, burned repeatedly, all of this because he allegedly looked at a white woman. And whilst what we're seeing today isn't quite as extreme as that, without the police presence, I do think that lives would be threatened. I do think there would be a very real case of serious violence. And instead of just condemning the violence like any reasonable person should, there are far too many people making excuses for it and saying it's all the fault of politicians. Well, politicians should take a lot of responsibility, absolutely. They're legislators, they're responsible for decisions. But I also believe that people are responsible for their own actions. If you make the decision to go out and join a mob, and you make the decision to get blind drunk, throw things at the police, and engage in violence, that's 100% on you. That's it. I'm not going to apologise for telling the truth. I'm not going to apologise for calling out this extremism for what it is. And I find it deeply troubling. I think that, lives will be threatened. Now, people, of course, have a right to be concerned. I'm not saying that for a second. I'm saying that it's disingenuous to claim that these protests are entirely peaceful, because they're clearly not. Even a reform councillor in Warwickshire admitted that there may well be violent agitators getting involved. He admitted his concern about that. Yeah, some of it may be from left-wing counter-demonstrators. I wouldn't entirely trust them either. But for the right to claim that they're entirely peaceful and they're entirely moderate and they're simply concerned families, they're lying through their teeth. Absolutely lying through their teeth. Even if some of them are family members, like mothers or fathers, that doesn't preclude them from violence. It doesn't preclude them from criminality. But the lies are coming from pretending that it isn't the right that's fueling a lot of this. The lies are coming from insisting that it's all peaceful. The lies are coming from denying what was so blatantly obvious last year. And finally, I do think the right-wing press have a lot to answer for. It's legitimate to cover this stuff. It's legitimate to cover the small boats. It's legitimate to cover concerns. But GB News, for example, one of their reporters claimed there was no signs of right-wing involvement. That's just bad journalism. It's just dishonest. Because if he actually dug a little deeper, he would see that there is absolutely right-wing influences stoking this stuff online. I mean, there is a lot of channels out there, I've seen them, that have quite a lot of influence, much bigger than this channel, and they're using it to promote conspiracy theories about the deep state and about how the police are against everyone, etc. Now, my view is the police should be criticised, but we need to be very careful to avoid these crass statements. For example, the police are only serving the political left or things like this. Well, yesterday, 400 people were arrested in the Palestine Action protests. So how does that square up to those right-wingers who think the police only target the right? I do think the police have a lot to answer for. Their pathetic response to just stop oil and insulate Britain set in the rot. I think the police have done a bad job of getting public trust, a really bad job. They've done themselves no favours. The thing I reported the other day when they told off a shopkeeper for calling thieves scum, things like that. The police really do themselves no favours. The use of non-crime hate incidents, things like that. But I still think people should be careful about getting into outright conspiracy theories and saying all the police are serving the left. Or one I've heard a lot is the police actively us in, bring in the left-wing counter-demonstrators. What has actually happened is they've escorted them because of the risk of violence. Now, to me, that's common sense, keeping aside two different factions. Both sides are allowed to have their voice, but just keep them apart. That is hardly the same as the police actually supporting one side over the other. I do have some sympathy for the police in these situations. They are dealing with a lot of angry people, some of them who are prepared to use violence. So that's how I see it. And as if I didn't need to make this clear, I absolutely support the right to protest genuinely peaceful. I just don't think these protests have been entirely peaceful. I think that's a lie. And for right-wing commentators to claim it's all an invention of the left, they're lying through their teeth. There is a lot of influence out there, not just from right-wing tabloids and from GB News, but online on independent channels that are really stoking this stuff up. And it's a powder keg situation. I'm really concerned that someone will die at some point. All it takes is for some of these guys to get into one of those hotels, they'll set it on fire, and we're going to see a massacre. I don't want to scaremonger. It hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, it won't happen. But really, there is extremism out there, and it troubles me. And as for migrants who come here and commit crime, they should be deported. I say to them, is that how you're thinking a country that's giving you protection? Is that how you're thinking a country that's giving you refuge? Anyone who supports Islamist ideology, who supports so-called honour crimes, that sort of thing, should not be in this country. That goes without saying. But I know for a fact the migrants include Christians who are persecuted in Iran and Afghanistan, and also Muslim minority groups like the Ahmadis and the Sufis. That's a fact. That's an absolute fact. So I reject this vilification of all migrants. Yes, technically they've come here illegally, but we have plenty of domestic criminals. For all this moral outrage about migrants, the same people who are protesting in Epping and Islington and elsewhere, where there are protests over shoplifters, where there are protests over British criminals, there's plenty to choose from. Some have suggested that if we deport all foreign criminals, it will ease the overcrowding issue. I think it will a bit, because we have 10,000 foreign nationals in our prisons. But we have plenty of homegrown criminals as well. So I think there's hypocrisy on the part of these protests. Why is the moral outrage only directed at migrants? Why is it not this situation when a British man is arrested on suspicion of rape? There's plenty of examples of it. So I do think that there is definitely nefarious groups stoking this stuff up. And I think there's a racist component when people are demonstrating hostility towards all foreigners. There is examples of that. I came across a video somewhere in the Midlands where these vigilantes saw some migrants at a war memorial. I think, yeah, it was Leicester. Well, the migrants, one of them was smoking a spliff. Now, that's an illegal drug. It's disrespectful around a war memorial. But other than that, they weren't necessarily being violent. Well, they weren't being violent. They weren't vandalizing the war memorial. They were just sitting there. And these so-called patriots confronted them. One of them was munching on a bag of crisps. That isn't particularly respectful either. One of them openly admitted that he was a migrant hunter. And from what I saw in the video, all the aggression was coming from the so-called patriots. These are the same people that will get boozed up at a football match and then get onto a train, throw the weight around, do what they want. So I'm calling out right-wing hypocrisy. This claim that they're all upstanding citizens. A lot of them have convictions for domestic violence. They're not upstanding citizens. In many cases, they're just yobs. And again, simply because someone's a mother doesn't make her immune from criminality. It doesn't mean that she's going to be a good mother. It doesn't mean that she's going to be someone who is a responsible citizen. I mean, some of the parents that were involved in the violence last year, it was disgusting to see they were bringing their children along. What sort of influence is that on a child? And, this thing about protecting children, imagine how traumatizing that would be to bring a child to a riot. The Ballymena pogrom, the mob was talking about protecting women and girls. Some of those houses that were targeting had women and girls in them. Yes, it's true that a lot of the migrants are male, but there are also some women and children. And so when they're collectively vilified, they're included. It's not like the mob is going to differentiate. I know this video will be polarizing. It might be unpopular, but I don't care. I'm telling the truth here. I'm saying that there is a problem in our society. There is extremism at play. There are bad people fueling the flames of hatred, fueling the flames of violence, and they're not bringing about solutions. I'm not talking about people who are concerned about immigration. I'm not talking about people who say, for example, that migrants who commit crimes should be deported. I'm one of those people. I'm talking about people whose attitude to violence and rioting is to deny it and to enable the thugs who are doing it. Shame on all of you.